G20 leaders failed to agree on financing climate change action. However, they have pledged support for multilateralism, the global south, and an open economy. But how would the group enforce all of this? And what will Donald Trump's return mean for the world order? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. Leaders of the world's largest economies have wrapped up a two-day meeting in Brazil where they committed to tackling poverty, inequality, and climate change. The wars in Ukraine and the Middle East were also high on the agenda, as were global trade and the world economy. But the elephant in the room in all of these discussions was Donald Trump. The incoming U.S. president has pledged to change radically or reshape America's role in all of these areas. So will the commitments Washington makes over the next 2 months survive under the new Trump administration? And what's the future of the G20 and multilateralism during another America First presidency? We'll discuss all that and more. First, though, this report from Ferdia Carr.
An ambitious goal for leaders of the world's top economies. Speaking at the G20 summit, Brazil's President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva prioritized tackling poverty, hunger and inequality.
It falls to those gathered around this table to tackle the urgent task of ending this scourge that shames humanity. For this reason, we've made the launch of a global alliance against hunger and poverty the central goal of Brazil's G20 presidency. This will be our greatest legacy.
Those ambitions, however, are unlikely to match the America First agenda of the incoming U.S. president. With just 2 months until Donald Trump takes office, his second term hung over every issue discussed in Rio de Janeiro. For Western allies at the summit, Ukraine was top of the agenda, the US, having just eased restrictions on Ukraine's use of tactical missiles against Russia, urged others to support Kyiv.
The United States strongly supports Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Everyone around this table, in my view, should as well. And by the way, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine led to the highest record food prices in all of history.
Trump has criticized the extent of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine and says he'll end the war swiftly with a negotiated peace deal, one that would likely demand Ukraine cede territory captured by Russia. On Israel's war on Gaza and its escalating attacks on Lebanon, G20 leaders urged a comprehensive ceasefire. Trump has pledged to achieve what the Biden administration has not, ending the conflict in the Middle East. But with his history of making concessions to Israel, such as recognizing Jerusalem as its capital in his first term, many are skeptical. China's President Xi Jinping led calls for G20 members to commit to global free trade. Trump has threatened Beijing with punitive import tariffs, a move economists warn will punish consumers on both sides. And then there's climate change. Funding for sustainable development and energy transition were the focus on the final day of talks in Rio de Janeiro. Hopes of any significant U.S. contribution lie with the president-elect, who says climate change is a hoax and is expected to again pull America out of the Paris Climate Agreement. In their joint declaration, leaders made broad commitments to continued cooperation on all these issues and more. But Trump's second term cast doubt on whether the G20's spirit of multilateralism can survive the America First doctrine. Ferdia Carr, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in all our guests. In Rio and attending the G20 events is Laura Carvalho, Director of Economic and Climate Prosperity at the Open Society Foundations. In Hong Kong is Professor Alejandro Reyes, a senior fellow at the Center on Contemporary China and the World at the University of Hong Kong. And you were formerly a senior policy advisor in Canada's Foreign Ministry. And joining us from Ifran, Morocco is Nizar Missari, a professor of international studies at Al Ahawain University and a global affairs analyst. Welcome, all of you, to Inside Story. So in just a moment, I'll try and get a sense from all of you on just how useful any international gathering right now, including, of course, this G20, can be as we await the transition between Biden and Trump. But Laura, since you're on the ground in Rio, can you first describe what it's like for our viewers and for people like myself who've never been to a G20, what it's like to attend a G20 summit, what you've been doing there over the last 2 days, and what you feel you've achieved.
The civil society and academics who are taking part are in side events. There was also a social G20 last week, which gathered many civil society organizations, political actors from different countries, think tanks, academics for discussions. These are the so-called G20 engagement groups, which are basically those who are not heads of states or from government delegations who engage with the issues and make proposals for the governments to consider in the G20 declaration and communique, which came out last night. I think this was one of the most participatory G20 processes that we had. Brazil's leadership actually made sure to have a big social process, as well as the leaders and finance ministers, different official tracks. And so this is something that I think has to be praised of the Brazilian presidency of the G20.
So this is civil society groups that get together and provide ideas, act a little bit as a think tank or a laboratory of ideas for world leaders. Is that fair?
These groups have met the entire year. So, of course, this culminated in the meeting and the summit last week and in the past 2 days. But these groups have been creating policy proposals, policy briefs that have been released. We also had civil society organizations who met in different gatherings. For example, on the taxing the super rich proposal that Brazil has managed to include in the communique. Of course, there's still many steps for this to be implemented, but the declaration that came out yesterday does mention taxing the super rich. This is a theme that has engaged many actors from different countries over time to put pressure on their leaders to make sure that this proposal moved forward and actually made it to this declaration. That's just an example of something that has involved many more people than the actual government delegations. And
we like examples. It makes it easier to understand. Where do you feel you were most successful? Do you have ideas you felt connected with world leaders or that were better received by world leaders than others?
Well, as any multilateral process, particularly with the global north and the developed countries not being as ready to commit more resources, right, for climate finance, for development finance, for many of the asks that global south countries have in this moment. Of course, it wasn't an easy process. And now with the US elections, I think that process becomes even more difficult. But we did manage, for instance, to have for the first time in an unprecedented the G20 discussion, the issue of inequality at the core. Inequality within countries and inequality between countries. This is at the center of the declaration that came out. We also have the proposal for tax cooperation for taxing wealthy individuals that is made to the declaration. On climate finance, we have a roadmap for the multilateral development banks and what they should do to be able to lend more money and more affordable finance for the climate transition in the global south. And there's also language in the declaration on industrial policy in the developing countries and the need for them to add value and to be part of global value chains. So my sense is that this, in spite of the very difficult geopolitical context, has been an ambitious and one of the most progressive G20 declarations that we've ever seen, I would say. And I think that speaks to the role that global south countries have when they lead multilateral processes. So the more role for global south countries, I think the more we can achieve, especially in this moment with post-US election.
Yeah, it's really interesting to get the perspective of somebody who's actually there, who's on the ground. Nizar, Alejandro, thank you very much for your patience up to this point. Nizar, is it, and maybe I'm being provocative here, or maybe not, you'll tell me, is it a waste of time to hold a G20 when you don't really have the U.S. president who's about to be running the show 2 months from now?
Absolutely not a waste, in the sense that if we consider it a waste, that means that we focus too much on the US. And I think that's not fair to the rest of the world. I think that a lot of things happen out of the US and a lot of things happen in other parts of the world, in Africa, in Asia, in South America. So this focus on the US is way too important from my point of view. Not that I underestimate the role and the weight of the US, but things happen in the rest of the world. And the agenda that Dr. Carvalho brought up here is a testimony to the importance of what the Global South can bring. The G20 is a place where an organization like the African Union has a place. So, and there are not that many places where Africa can speak with one voice and express its concerns and present its agenda. So I'm not saying that the G20 is wonderful and it needs to be reformed, but I think that it is important to meet and to talk and to advance an agenda with or without Trump. So with Trump, it will be far more difficult, but without Trump, things will be possible. I think also
what's the highlight? If I can just jump in, Nizar, what's the highlight of this G20 for you? What's the highlight of this G20 for you?
Well, the first thing is from reading the Brazilian press, it's obvious that this G20, the social part of the G20 has been very important. The voice of the social society, civil society, and the input it has had on the agenda that world leaders have had. This is something new. We don't know whether this will continue, but this is a very important innovation that brings the voices of those who are dealing on the ground with issues. So I think that this is an important element. And the fact that we focus too much on what states do, by focusing too much on what states do, we forget that international relations happen at many different levels, and they happen at the level of businesses, but they also happen at the level of civil society. And what happened last week in Rio de Janeiro, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, was the voice of resistance to these changes that some world leaders, from Milei to Trump, are trying to bring to international relations. So I think that it's important to hear these other voices and to see that and to observe that they are there to resist what has been taking place, and they are engaged in that resistance.
Alejandro, you've worked specifically, I believe, when you were at the Canadian Foreign Ministry some years ago. You worked on proposals, right? Submitting proposals for this forum and how it could work. How successful on a scale of 1 to 10 would you say this G20 has been?
Oh, that's a tough question. I would say, look, I think what Laura mentioned, the fact that civil society is participating, and you have a B20 process, the business community, you have a T20 think tank community, you have L20 labor, you have many different types of G20s going on. When you focus on just the summit that's happening now, you forget that there's a whole process of the G20 and the various streams that's going on throughout the year. And there are many discussions on many different issues. And so, to give a grade to just the summit I don't think it's practical. I don't think it means anything.
Okay, fine. Drop the grade. Let me rephrase the question. For people who are not scholars of international relations, right, and who look at these fora and kind of wonder, well, what does this mean for the world? What's the takeaway from this? What would you tell them?
So I would just go back to a little bit in history to the global financial crisis, when in 2009, you had a big meeting in Pittsburgh, And the G7 at that time, the premier forum for managing the global economy, essentially ceded that position to the G20 because you needed greater representation of developing economies, emerging markets, you couldn't just manage the global economy using just the industrialized nations coming together. So that was really the coming of age of the G20. Now, they were very focused on the global financial crisis and trying to recover from that. But now that the G20 is at the summit level, has expanded its agenda, it's more difficult then to come and establish a consensus when your agenda has gotten much broader into social issues, into climate. When they were focused on recovery from the global financial crisis, I would say it showed how essential the G20 was at that time. But in the intervening years, we've been challenged. How effective is the G20 today when its agenda has broadened? And
is
you
it
can
too broad?
hear the criticism. Well, I would argue that maybe it is. I mean, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has come out and said, the G20 as a forum is not working. It produces statements that he said nobody reads. And so, I'm all for talking about hunger, talking about poverty, talking about climate change. But when you have a global forum of so many participants, it's great to hear the voices. But at the end of the day, decisions or statements are based on lowest common denominator agreements. In other words, there has to be unanimity for any statement to be made. And that creates difficulty in terms of effectiveness of an organization, of any multilateral organization.
Laura, so as you explained to us at the top of the show that you took part in the civil society work, right? Groundwork, legwork to promote ideas, to submit to world leaders. And that you also explained that a lot of the final communique drew on these ideas, on inequality, fighting inequality, poverty and hunger, on taxing the super rich, on climate finance. There isn't an enforcement mechanism at the G20, right? So for somebody like yourself, how do you think about that? How limiting is that? Because you could make the argument that if you just read the communique, with absent an enforcement mechanism, it's a wish list.
That's true, and I think we shouldn't be overestimating the role of the G20. So I completely agree that this is not a process that can actually implement things, right? It's not the UN, which has a mandate for some issues, or the OECD, which has a mandate for other issues, even though it's a smaller club, that can actually have policies that come out of it. The G20 is mostly a forum for proposals or for paving the way, and these proposals need to be picked up. And in order to move forward, they need to be picked up by the Financing for Development Conference of the UN, by COP, by other multilateral spaces, and by the countries themselves unilaterally, right, in some of these initiatives. But I would say that, for instance, we've seen in the past couple of years agendas that, based on statements on, for example, the role of multilateral development banks and how they could be taking up more risk to lend more money at affordable interest rates for countries who engage in the climate transition, just to pick an example. This has been a report, an expert report, and it came into the communique of the G20 a couple of years ago. It then led to changes and a roadmap by the World Bank that had to respond to that and change its structure. I don't want to oversee this. I think it's way less than what we need to do. There needs to be more commitment of capital to the MDBs, which is not part of the agenda. But anyway, we saw a response from the World Bank that had to give a response to that G20 declaration. And now that roadmap actually has been completely published in the finance tract of this G20. And so Now there are immediate steps that will be taken by the World Bank to comply with that reform agenda. And so there can be, I think for some agendas, it is a first step that makes things easier. But of course, we have to continue to put pressure and to work in these spaces to get the international financial institutions or the rich countries to actually comply with what they said.
Okay.
But if you start with some language, it's better than nothing, right? And I would say that given the minimum common denominator problem that has been mentioned, it's even surprising with all the geopolitical problems that this world is facing, that there is even a declaration that has common ground, right, with those 20 countries, plus the African Union. And that speaks of inequality, that speaks of taxing the super rich. We're talking about countries governed by very different political coalitions here. So I have to say, I was surprised that these things even made to the declaration, especially knowing how diplomacy works, and these processes are really hard in a moment of war in the world.
I want to take this to Nizar.
I'm surprised that we have such a progressive, ambitious G20 declaration, and I think this has been a little bit the fruit of G20.
Okay, I gotta go take this to Nizar and share out the talking time. Nizar, you were making a really interesting point earlier. You were saying, look, everything doesn't revolve around the U.S. Just because we're in a moment of political transition in the U.S. and just because Trump may not be on board. In fact, we know he's not on board with a majority of the things that are in this G20 communique. The world can still act, can still move on, things can still be done absent the U.S. or outside of the U.S.'s orbit. Can you expand on that and maybe give us some examples of where you think, the world can achieve things that are not necessarily what Trump will try to achieve?
I think that one of the agendas is this agenda that the Brazilian government proposed of fighting hunger and poverty. This is something that would not have been present on a gathering like this one if it were not for the Brazilian presidents of the G20. Many other countries from the global south would not have proposed this. So the fact that all these world leaders have agreed on a common agenda, and the Inter-American Development Bank has mobilized funds to deal with the issue, all of these things mean that things can happen when there is an enlightened leadership from global leaders. But here I will go into the other direction and to run the risk of contradicting myself. Where I speak from, we see the last night's declaration on Gaza, for instance, as more words and more words. People are dying in Gaza, people are dying in Lebanon, and we call for a ceasefire, and there is no mobilization of a peacekeeping force. There is no mobilization to defend the Palestinian people. There is no mobilization to defend the Lebanese people. And whereas there is an agenda in the world, there is the responsibility to protect. We agreed on these things many years ago, but it seems that the Palestinians and the Lebanese do not deserve to be protected as human beings who are being massacred and genocided by the state of Israel. So I think that this is my frustration from where I speak from my place, that there are words that are just said there and do not mean anything because these words do not impact us, unfortunately.
Alejandro Reyes, you describe yourself as an unapologetic globalist. So, and I saw some of your reaction to what was being said, but yeah, I saw that on your Twitter feed that you describe yourself as an unapologetic globalist. I assume you have some trepidation, maybe some fears, based on your social media posts that I've been reading, on what may be ushered in with the next Trump presidency.
Let me make 2 points. One is, again, I go back to the global financial crisis. After that, you saw the G20 act in terms of reforming international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, trying to make the quota system more equitable, give greater voice to developing economies, including China. That reform kind of moved forward, but then stalled a bit. And then you also had a movement towards global minimum tax that was led by G20. I mean, these are concrete measures, or at least steps, initiatives that came out of the G20 that worked to some extent or moved forward. But once you get into the realm of, climate finance, widen the agenda, I go back to that. And you're talking about Gaza, Ukraine. Again, trying to get anything meaningful is very difficult. Now, your question, if you have a Trump who's coming into office, who is clearly a disruptor in terms of the multilateral system, just think back to the disruption that occurred in the 2018, I believe, G20 meeting in Charlevoix in Quebec, in Canada, where he really upset the apple cart. On the horizon, will Trump be a similar disruptor of the G20? Well, we've had 3 years now, India, Brazil, next year, South Africa, a great troika of the global South hosting, being president of the G20. Who's president in 2026? Donald Trump. So Donald Trump will be the U.S. will be president of the G20 in 2026. And I can tell you that Donald Trump would love, to be host of a multilateral organization like the G20 at one of his properties, one of his golf clubs or whatever. I'm sure that might be the case, but he won't miss a chance to be strutting the world stage, directing all these leaders coming to the United States. So maybe there might be hope if Donald Trump sees 2026 as an opportunity for him to show off his America First agenda on the international stage.
Okay, I want to thank all our guests. That's the time we have for today. Thank you so much to Laura Carvalho, Alejandro Reyes, and Nizar Missari for joining us. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X, our handle, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Cyril Vanier, and the whole team here, bye for now.